Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Reddit Family Secrets. Thank you so much for all the love and support you have been pouring into this channel. It genuinely keeps us going. Today's story comes from a woman in Nashville, Tennessee, and I have to warn you, by the time you reach the end, your jaw is going to be on the floor. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't something you plan. Sometimes it walks right up to you, introduces itself, and says, "I think we need to talk." My name is Callie. And for 9 years, I believed I had built a life worth envying. Marcus and I met at a friend's wedding in Memphis when we were both 26. He was charming, ambitious, and had a laugh that could fill a room. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony on the banks of the Cumberland River. And for a long time, a genuinely long time, things were good. We built a house in a quiet suburb outside of Nashville. We built a small event planning business together that I poured my entire soul into. We talked about kids, about growing old, about all the ordinary, beautiful things that couples talk about when they still trust each other completely. What I did not know, what I was carefully and deliberately kept from knowing, was that Marcus had spent the last 3 years of our marriage quietly dismantling everything I thought was ours. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in October. I was reconciling the books for our business when I noticed a series of wire transfers I didn't recognize. Small amounts at first, the kind you might dismiss as vendor fees or supply costs. But they didn't match any invoice I could find. When I dug deeper, I discovered that Marcus had been siphoning money from our joint business account into a separate account I had never seen. An account tied to a woman named Deja. I didn't know Deja personally, but I knew the name. Deja Harmon was a real estate agent in our area, someone Marcus had mentioned in passing a handful of times over the years. Professional contact, he had always said. Nothing more. The bank statements told a very different story. When I confronted Marcus that evening, I was prepared for denial, for anger, for tears. What I was not prepared for was the cold, almost clinical way he looked at me and said, "Callie, you've been suffocating me for years." I stayed out of loyalty, but loyalty only goes so far. He moved out within the week, taking our shared laptop, his portion of the savings, and what was left of my ability to trust anyone. For the first 2 months after Marcus left, I did what a lot of people do after that kind of gutting betrayal. I survived. I showed up to run the business on autopilot. I smiled at clients. I cried in the car. I watched Marcus post photographs on Instagram of himself and Deja at restaurants I used to suggest to him, at concerts we were supposed to attend together, living a life built on the rubble of ours. What made it worse was the reaction from people we both knew. Because Marcus was charming, remember, I mentioned that, and charm is a weapon. He had spent weeks before he left carefully planting seeds in the minds of our social circle. By the time I realized what he had done, the narrative was already set. Callie was controlling. Callie was emotionally unavailable. Callie drove him away. The business had been mostly his idea, really. It was during those 2 months of social exile that I first heard from Vivienne. Vivienne was the last person I ever expected to call me. We had met a few times at industry events over the years, and I knew enough about her history with Marcus to feel a complicated twist in my stomach every time her name came up. Years before I entered the picture, Marcus had been in a business partnership with Vivienne. They had co-founded a small hospitality consulting firm in downtown Nashville. By all accounts, they had been building something real. And then, according to the version of the story Marcus had always told me, Vivienne had become unstable and difficult, and he had been forced to buy her out under painful circumstances. Marcus had been very thorough in his portrait of Vivienne. Volatile, vindictive, not someone I would want to know. When she called me, I almost didn't pick up, but something made me answer. Her voice was nothing like what I had expected. It was measured and quiet, and she said only, "I heard what happened. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I think there are things about Marcus that you deserve to know, and things about what he did to me that I have never been able to prove alone." We met the following Saturday at a coffee shop in East Nashville, a small place with exposed brick walls and the kind of playlist that makes you feel like you are in a scene you did not expect. I arrived 20 minutes early. I was nervous, though I could not have told you exactly why. Vivienne was already there. She was poised and professional, somewhere in her early 40s, with the kind of composure that comes not from ease, but from surviving things that should have broken you. She slid a folder across the table before we had even ordered. Inside were documents I had never seen. Emails between Marcus and a business attorney, dated 3 years into his partnership with Vivienne, laying out a strategy to force her out of the company using a clause buried in their original operating agreement. A clause that Marcus himself had inserted without her knowledge during a document revision she had never been shown. The strategy had worked. Vivienne had lost her stake in the company, her professional reputation in Nashville's tight-knit hospitality community, and 2 years of income while she rebuilt from nothing. And then I showed her what I had found in our business accounts. We spent 4 hours in that coffee shop, 2 women who had been handed the same lie from the same source, watching the full shape of it come into focus. By the time we left, the pretense of a casual meeting had long since evaporated. What had taken its place was something more durable, a shared purpose. The invitation arrived 6 weeks later. Marcus was hosting what he had billed, with absolutely zero self-awareness, as a fresh start celebration. A party at a rented event space in the Gulch, the kind of sleek glass and steel venue that costs more per hour than most people make in a day. Deja had apparently helped plan it. The guest list included nearly every mutual contact from our years together, everyone from vendors we had worked with to friends who had quietly chosen his side. He had, without any apparent irony, sent me an invitation. I suspect it was meant to wound me, a reminder of everything he had moved on to. Vivienne and I had a different idea about what the evening might accomplish. I wore a deep emerald dress that night, the color of something deliberate. Vivienne wore midnight blue. We arrived together, unhurried, and when the elevator doors opened onto the event space, the room did what rooms do when something unexpected enters them. It went still. I watched the recognition move across faces and waves. First confusion, then recalculation, then the specific, uncomfortable energy of people who realize they have been standing on the wrong side of a story. I saw Marcus from across the room before he saw me. He was laughing at something, a glass of bourbon in his hand, entirely at ease in the kingdom he had built on other people's losses. And then he turned. The bourbon glass did not shatter the way champagne glasses do in movies, but the expression on his face was its own kind of breaking. His eyes moved from me to Vivienne and back again, and I watched him run the calculation and come up short. He crossed the room in long strides, jaw tight, smile fixed in that practiced way of his. "Callie." His voice was low and controlled. "What is this?" "It's a celebration," I said. "You said so yourself on the invitation." Vivienne smiled beside me, not unkindly, but with the patience of someone who has waited a very long time for a particular moment. "Hello, Marcus. It's been a while." He recovered quickly, the way charming people do. He tried to steer the conversation toward the private, tried to position us as a distraction to be managed. But the room had already oriented itself toward us because that is what rooms do when the energy shifts. I reached into my clutch and placed an envelope on the nearest table between us. "Since we're celebrating new beginnings," I said, "I thought this was the right occasion." He picked it up with the steady hands of a man who has not yet realized that steadiness will not save him. Inside were 2 things. A formal complaint filed with the Tennessee Department of Commerce regarding the fraudulent operating agreement used to force Vivienne from her partnership, supported by the documentation we had compiled, and a civil suit filed jointly by Vivienne and me regarding the misappropriation of funds from our business accounts, including the transfers to a holding company we had recently traced back to a property investment in Deja's name. It turned out that Marcus's scheme had been more elaborate than either of us initially understood. The money he had moved out of our business hadn't just funded his personal life. It had been used as seed capital for a real estate venture that he and Deja were running under a shell company. A venture built, in part, on funds he had no legal right to touch. Marcus read the documents once. Then again, his face did not go red the way an angry person's face goes red. It went blank, which is somehow worse. Deja appeared at his shoulder a moment later, read a single line, and took 2 careful steps backward. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The guests who had spent months accepting Marcus's version of every story were now very quietly pulling out their phones, and not to capture a happy moment. "You told me I was suffocating you," I said. I think what you meant was that I was paying attention. The legal proceedings that followed were not fast, and they were not easy, but they were thorough, with the documentation Vivienne and I had assembled, supplemented by the financial forensics that emerged once attorneys became involved. The case against Marcus was harder to dismiss than he had anticipated. The shell company became a liability rather than an asset. The real estate venture stalled. The Tennessee complaint triggered a regulatory review that cost him 2 significant professional contracts. The Fresh Start celebration turned out to be something closer to a last stand. Marcus and Deja's relationship, which had been presented to the world as a grand passion, did not survive the legal pressure. People who build things on convenient foundations tend to find those foundations inconvenient when circumstances change. He moved out of the condo they had shared within a few months of the suit being filed. The social circle that had accepted his version of events gradually, quietly, redistributed itself. Vivienne received a settlement that, while imperfect, restored a meaningful portion of what she had lost. I recovered enough from the business accounts to rebuild the firm on my own terms I controlled entirely this time. We still work together occasionally. What began as a shared grievance became something more useful, a genuine professional respect, and a friendship neither of us had planned on. I want to be honest with you about something, because this channel is called Reddit Family Secrets, and the name implies a kind of intimacy. I do not feel triumphant when I think about Marcus now. What I feel is something quieter and harder to name. A kind of relief that the truth, which had been there all along, became visible to enough people that it could no longer be managed. A gratitude that I did not simply absorb the version of myself he had been broadcasting and accept it as accurate. He told me I was suffocating. What he meant was that honesty made him uncomfortable. He told me I was controlling. What he meant was that I was paying close enough attention to notice things he needed me to miss. The woman Marcus had spent years describing as volatile and vindictive was none of those things. She was simply someone who had been wronged and had not been willing to pretend otherwise. I walked away from a carefully constructed lie. It was painful, and it took longer than I wanted, and there were days I did not think I would find my way to the other side of it. But I did, and I built something on the other side that belongs to me. If you're sitting somewhere right now, carrying a version of yourself that someone else wrote for you, I want you to know that the original draft still exists. You do not have to accept the revision. Before I go, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have reached out to Vivienne? Would you have taken that meeting, opened that folder, risked the complication? Or would you have kept your distance and let things unfold on their own? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I'm also curious. Where in the country are you watching from tonight? Drop your state below. We have listeners from all 50 states, and it always surprises me where these stories find people. And if you're new here, welcome to Reddit Family Secrets. Nearly 90% of the people who watch our videos have not yet subscribed. If this story meant something to you, the subscribe button is right there, and it helps this community grow. Next week, we have a story from a man in Phoenix who discovered, through a completely unexpected accident involving a shared cloud storage account, that his brother had been lying to their entire family for over a decade. You do not want to miss it. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves. And remember, the truth has a way of finding its own level, no matter how hard someone works to hold it down.